Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Joe and I'm the dad.
And I'm Rya, and I'm the daughter.
At the dinner table last night, I noticed that my wife was making spaghetti. So I thought I'll help her out. So I went in the refrigerator and I got some cheese and I grated it, set it on the table.
Uh-huh.
She didn't realize I did that. She went in and she grated some more cheese and she came in with it and saw that on the table. And she says, "Oh, I didn't know you did that."
Oh.
She says, "I did it too." I said, "Great minds think alike."
One of my kids this week was talking with a student at school about LGBTQ plus issues. And I thought it was funny. The student said, "Oh, well, I'm not really very accepting or affirming of LGBTQ plus issues because the Bible doesn't agree with LGBTQ." And I thought that was a funny way to say it.
Yeah, it is a funny way to say it.
But I think it's also really indicative of how a lot of people feel. I certainly was one of those people for many, many years. I actually wrote a paper when I was in seminary talking about LGBTQ plus issues, and the entire first half of the paper was just looking at the verses that come out in the Bible talking about LGBTQ issues, and my conclusion was, I think that the Bible says that it's wrong to be gay. I really wrestled with this for a long time. It was a hard struggle for me to try to figure out what to do with all of this.
I actually had some of those thoughts myself because for a long time, I would say I was on the other side. I wasn't a major objector, but I just thought it was wrong. Because, I mean, if the Bible says it's wrong, I guess it is, huh?
I remember coming home from college and we had been talking about something and it was not even relevant, but somehow the issue came up. And I remember you just making one little comment saying, "Well, you and I probably don't see eye to eye on that because I just believe what the Bible says." You maybe didn't even say it like that. It was just a little throwaway comment, but I remember that.
Well, whether you are a follower or not doesn't really have any impact on the subject that we've got coming up. What does have an impact on it is the fact that there are so many people that are using it to justify their position on both sides. If you're not a follower, you may be very aware of the arguments that people use on both sides. So it's something I think it'd be interesting for us to address here.
We're all moving, we're all on a journey. So
Yes.
you might be at a place where you're on your journey right now and you're pretty convinced with what the Bible says. Or you might be trying to wrestle through how does this all work and how do you feel? And you're thinking, well, if you become an LGBTQ plus ally, that you would have to abandon biblical values, or that you want to continue affirming biblical values, but you're not sure how to put these two together. And I think that's where a lot of people are right now. So let's talk first a little bit about the problem. What does the Bible actually say, and why might somebody feel like maybe if I hold biblical values, I can't be affirming?
So you're saying it's an either or situation. You have to be on one side or the other. There is no blending of the issues, no understanding both sides with something like that. You're saying you have to choose.
Well, it certainly felt that way to me. As somebody that wished that I didn't have to choose, I wrestled with this and wrestled with it. And at that point, when I wrote that paper, ended up saying, I don't see how I can view the Bible any other way. And I ended up in that paper, the second half of my paper, I said, I think that this is a real problem. And that's all I talked about. And I left it as a hanging issue, saying, I don't know how to answer this, but this is what the Bible says, and here's why I think that it doesn't really work together. Let's talk first and talk about what does the Bible say about it. There's really 6 verses that people will point to that are very clear. Now, you can point to a lot of other verses in the Bible that are relevant one way or another just for what it tells us about how sexuality works or what the Bible says about God's intentions for the world or a variety of other things. But there's 6 verses that people point to in general that are specifically, it seems, about gay and lesbian relationships. Now, the Bible is composed of the Old and New Testament. At least the Christian Bible is. Many people are surprised to discover that for Jewish people of faith, they have the exact same Bible for the Old Testament, and scholars will sometimes call that the Hebrew Bible, or I think they'll just call it the Bible, which breaks up into the first 5 books of the Bible they give a special value to. And that's the only section in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible that really says anything about being gay. Those 3 verses come from Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, where it says that it's wrong for a man to lie with another man as you would lie with a woman. Each of those verses says it in a little different way. The other passage comes from Genesis 19, where we know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where there were some visitors that came to Sodom, and the men in the city were not hospitable and tried to sexually assault these men. Scholars are generally pretty united in saying that that passage seems to be talking much more about being hospitable and the way that you treat guests, and it's not really talking about homosexuality. So I think in general, that one doesn't have nearly as much claim to say much about what it means to be gay or lesbian. And it's interesting that all of those passages, none of them talk about lesbian relationships. All of them talk exclusively about a man being with another man. Well, then when we get to the New Testament, that is specifically the Christian portion of the Christian Bible. That starts with Jesus, and the New Testament starts with 4 Gospels that tell the story of Jesus. And in the Gospels, there are no verses that talk about anything related to homosexuality at all. And then the second part of the New Testament is Jesus appointed certain apostles that then wrote letters to the church. And the second part of the New Testament is largely those apostles, after Jesus's death and resurrection, talking to the church about, well, how do we live now? And of those books that were written, none of them, except for one single author, the Apostle Paul, says anything about homosexuality. But Paul has 3 verses. One comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, where he's giving a whole list of things that it's wrong to do. And in that list, he says it's wrong to, and he coins a word in the Greek that basically means, I would translate it as man-betters. He seems to be referencing those passages from Leviticus 18 and 20, basically seeming to imply a man that sleeps with another man. And then he also talks about then the other man, and he has a specific idea in mind here. We would now call it, one would be the top and one would be the bottom. And he's kind of referencing both and saying both of those positions are wrong. And then in 1 Timothy chapter 1, there's another passage where there's another list of sins, and that homosexual comes up again, or sometimes translated in a variety of different ways. And then finally, there is a passage in Romans chapter 1. Paul is talking about the sins of the world and how people, when they turn away from God, here are some of the problems that people can get into. And one of them that he talks about is how people get into homosexual relationships. And that's the only passage, interestingly enough, where he mentions not only men, but also women in lesbian relationships. And so when you take a look at all of these passages together, there's a variety of ways that you can try to interpret them, but at least the base interpretation on the surface seems to be that Paul said it's wrong to be gay, and he pulled it from those verses in Leviticus, and he continued to affirm what those verses said. Story is told about Howard Thurman's grandmother. Howard Thurman was a black theologian. He told the story about his grandmother who had grown up as a slave. After she was freed, she said, I will never read those parts of the Bible written by the Apostle Paul because he said, "Slaves, obey your master." I had a theology professor in seminary who was black, who told the whole class that story. And I thought about those words in a way that I, as a white person, had never considered before, about how deeply that would impact someone. Of course, how could you deal with those passages if you had had your freedom entirely stripped away from you? And then once it was given to you, people came back to those verses. If you ever go and read what the Old Testament says about slavery or the New Testament, there's not a lot that's positive from our perspective now of what we would like it to say. I really wish there was a verse in the Bible that would just say it's wrong to own another human being. But unfortunately, there's not. There are some verses that are really detestable in what they say. The big one comes again from Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 25, there's a verse where Moses is laying down the law for the ancient Israelites and says, "As for male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from the aliens residing with you, and from their families that are with you, who have been born in the land, and they may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness." There are other passages that talk about if you have another Israelite slave, that you are to let them go after a certain amount of time, and there are different rules to basically say, if you have another Israelite, treat them well. But if you've got a slave from the surrounding nations, it is the same kind of slavery that we see anywhere else. Someone sent a letter to Dr. Laura back in the day, and he was kind of making fun of her faith at that time because, as you may remember, Dr. Laura was a very outspoken follower of the Jewish faith. And this person was poking fun and said, "Now, I've been reading through the Bible, and it says I may own slaves from surrounding nations. So somebody said it's wrong for me to own a Canadian. What do you think? Is it okay? Can I own a Canadian?" We all know it's wrong to own another human being. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now.
That makes me think of a group of people who came over here on an exchange program. We hosted some of those people from India. We took them to a variety of places. One of the places was a dairy farm. One of the women who thought cows were sacred saw those cows in the stanchions being milked and couldn't take it, turned around and flew out of that barn. Not literally, walked quickly, and was very, very traumatized by what she saw. Is that how we feel about people who think they own people as we own cows? And how other people might look at that?
We generally have consensus now in this day and age that it's wrong always to own another person. So there's a lot of ways that you can try to deal with that. For instance, you might look at some verses where Jesus talks about there were some of the laws that Moses gave because your hearts were hard, but that was never God's intention to begin with. Or you might look at the book of Galatians, again written by the Apostle Paul, where Paul is talking about certain laws about being circumcised. And Paul says, if you grew up in one of the surrounding nations and you want to follow Jesus, you do not need to go and get circumcised, which would have made it really hard to make more converts. I can't imagine that there were a lot of adult men that were saying, you know what I'd really like to do is go get circumcised.
I think I'd pass on that.
But so Paul says in the book of Galatians, look, it's never been about following the law. No, this has always been about faith in Jesus all the way along. The entire book of Galatians is just making the argument that the way those laws worked in the past is not how it works for us now. And in modern Judaism, there are other ways. Again, that's not my tradition, so I can't speak very well to that. But I know that there are other ways of dealing with, well, here's what the text says, but we don't view it the way that the text said before. We all have ways of navigating the text or negotiating with the Bible to make it line up with things that we know in our hearts are right or wrong. We know it's wrong to own another human being. I hope that we would all agree on that. And you can come up with your own way of how you deal with those passages. But whatever it is, we all recognize that we're not going to go out and try to own a Canadian.
First of all, I don't know where I'd let him sleep. Our house is small.
I saw a TikTok from a biblical scholar that he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but if you believe that slavery is wrong, you already have all of the tools you need to believe that the God of the Bible accepts and affirms gay and lesbian relationships.
What tools are we talking about? Are you talking about what people of today use as their argument that slavery is not acceptable? Is that where we're looking? Is it the interpretations that people see from a different perspective? Because there are so many perspectives on it. And are there people out there today that can still justify slavery because they think the Bible says it's appropriate? I don't have the answer.
The song Amazing Grace was written by a former slaver, by John Newton. And
Oh,
he
traitor.
recognized at some point that what he was doing was wrong. And so when he wrote that song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, he understood, he felt deeply to his core, I am a wretched man. That entire slave trade was absolutely wretched. So how do we then navigate using the Bible and holding biblical values while at the same time recognizing that we don't like or agree with what the Bible says about slavery? However you deal with the fact that you know in your heart of hearts that slavery is wrong, well, you can do that same thing with LGBTQ plus issues.
The people who own slaves and that are asked to release them, in most cases, that slave is their greatest asset because they own the slave, and the value of that slave is much more than the value of a horse or a cow or anything else. And therefore, that is a huge donation that they're asking you to give. So you can see why people would object to that. You can see where the conflict comes in and how somebody who is thinking of what a wretched person I was and I own this, how that can affect them dramatically.
I thought to myself a few times as we were preparing for this episode, I, as a white person, what if I had grown up in antebellum South in the time when slavery was legal? Even if I was not a slave owner, I would clearly be benefiting from a very unjust system. When you're in that system, it's terrible for everyone. Anybody that wants to try to do the right thing. If you're a slave, it's obviously terrible. But if you're benefiting from that system, now you are put in a place where, through no fault of your own, you are now benefiting from a deeply unjust system. How would you navigate that? I don't know. That would be challenging.
Are you suggesting that there are people right now who are benefiting from oppressing people who are gay and lesbian?
Well, yes, and I would want to be very careful. I would not say that the issue, as you and I talked about in a previous episode, we want to be very careful when we talk about the marginalization that LGBTQ people face and comparing that to the marginalization that people of color face. They are very different things. However, When we're talking about the way that people use the Bible to justify biblical values that are unjust towards people, I think we can see a parallel there. Imagine how unjust it is to say to somebody, you can never have a romantic relationship with anyone that you find attractive. Imagine if I said that to you. Your relationship with mom is not an okay relationship. God thinks that you are in sin for your relationship with mom. Can you imagine how that would make you feel and how unjust that would be?
That would be devastating.
It's a central part of your life,
Absolutely.
the central part of your life.
Yes.
Who you are as a person. I relate to you not just as my dad, but as also my mom and my dad together. You're a couple together. And if I ever looked to you and said, I think that your relationship with mom is wrong in the eyes of God, it would not just change your relationship with her, but it would change my relationship with you and everything about that.
It certainly would. It's a difficult thing to even imagine. I often say that if there's something that's really critical, it isn't something that God buries in two or three passages somewhere, but he shouts them at you. You know which topic has more about it than any other topic in the Bible? Money. That occurs in many, many, many references. It seems to be like the big thing. There are other things too. There are people who will follow a certain thing because they found one passage somewhere. In the Old Testament, for example, there's a passage that some people interpret to mean that you shouldn't be using instrumentation in worship. However, those people ignore Psalm 148, 149, and 150, which says, worship God with cymbals and clanging bells and a variety of things. But some people take that one passage and they think, this is something I shouldn't be doing because that passage implied that that's the situation. Certain sects believe they shouldn't have their picture taken because they have found a passage that said you should not have a graven image, which they interpret as a photograph. There are people who say you should be celebrating the Sabbath on Saturday rather than on Sunday. Many of the Christian religions follow that, and many don't. Many follow the Sunday idea. Some things have some minor things addressed to them, and some things really have a major focus. And I think the major focus is the one that if we're into acquiring more money, we kind of ignore a lot of those passages.
I think it's interesting in the Gospels. You see them wrestling with this question. They ask, what is the greatest commandment? I think to myself, that's a very different question than I would have asked when I was writing that paper. When I was writing that paper, I thought to myself, how can we make sure we're doing justice to every single verse in the Bible? But yet, you see in those passages in the Gospels that Jesus is putting the focus on what's most important. And interestingly enough, he singles out two passages. One of them comes from the book of Deuteronomy. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second, ironically, comes from Leviticus chapter 19. Love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19, the chapter that comes right between Leviticus 18 and 20 that we talked about at the beginning of this podcast. Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 say it's wrong for a man to lie with another man. And yet, sandwiched right between those two is one of the most important verses in all of the Bible. Love your neighbor as yourself. If Jesus is saying that the important part is to love, and if we in our society understand that it's unjust to keep somebody from a loving relationship that's not hurting anyone else, then it seems like the emphasis that we should put is on the love rather than on the rules that are treating other people unjustly.
And there are so many different interpretations of those same rules. I don't think I have all the answers. I don't think anyone does. In any particular group where they say there's a united belief, we all believe this and we all believe that, I don't think so. If I was going to find a group or an organization or a sect that I had no disagreements with, I'd be the only member. That's why there are so many interpretations of just about every aspect of the Bible. We don't really know or understand. We just have to interpret how should we be following the greatest commandment. In John 10:10, Jesus said, I came that you should have life and have it in the full. Hey, that sounds good to me. Yes, we should enjoy life. That's how I interpret that. Enjoy it. Have life. Have it in the full. And one of the ways we can do that, nothing, I think, can make us feel better about ourselves than treating other people as though they too deserve that same life in the full.
Now, whether you yourself hold to biblical values or that is not who you are, I hope that you got something out of this podcast. We've been looking at ways to approach what the Bible says for somebody that does hold to biblical values. And we avoided entirely the topic of how do we interpret the specific verses. That could be a whole topic in and of itself. But what we did do is talk about how do we deal with issues of justice in a text that can be difficult to know how we apply it at certain times. And I think we all know that we want to live a life that values other people, where we live with love and treat one another with dignity in everything that we do. And I hope that we've inspired you to do just that. We're grateful to have you coming back week after week here and listening to what we have to say. And I hope you'll keep coming back here.
And with that, we'll see you Monday.